Hello, in this video I wanted to start a new series in the context of space privatization that I think is pretty interesting because I think that it'll be something that I think is a little bit different than a lot of the other series that I do where I kind of focus on like a much broader literature base. And in this series I want to talk about a specific author that I think will be really prevalent on the space resolution, especially when thinking about the relevance of like black feminist literature and black feminist texts in the context of the resolution, and that is Alexis Pauline Gumbs. I think that the Alexis Pauline Gumbs' writing is, I think, extremely good for affirmative teams that are trying to figure out ways in which they can incorporate or think through black feminist literature in relationship to the concepts of like space, archiving, ideas about futurism and apocalypticism. And I think there are a lot of ideas that what Alexis Gumbs is kind of like talking about is extremely relevant to the space privatization topic. And so I kind of wanted to do just like a little mini series where I kind of like only talk about the context of like this all as an affirmative argument, and then kind of like what it means for teams to kind of try to answer this affirmative argument from different vantage points. And so in this first video I kind of want to do just a broader introduction into the work that Alexis Gumbs kind of has been doing up until this point, and like what's really relevant in the context of the space privatization resolution. And then after that, kind of like transition into talking a little bit more about the ways in which Gumbs is particularly used on the affirmative as a particularly useful argument for thinking about ideas about like survival, the remastery of tech, and the ways in which like black feminist kind of like archival projects are kind of like intimately connected to the processes by which we understand like our relationship to like the future, and the way that we kind of like understand like how the kind of like processes of like scholastic production that happens from black feminism like has the power to kind of like explore and change the ways that we think about like the human, and an exploration of black feminist theory as it relates to like the human in various contexts of politics. And I think that Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work is really important and influential in this area, because I think that in the context of space overall, there are a lot of really interesting things that that Alexis Pauline Gumbs is kind of like thinking about in the context of space. I feel like if you're kind of like starting and just getting into our work, a lot of the places where you'll see kind of people read, I think the most amount of work from Alexis Pauline Gumbs is like from her dissertation, which was a really amazing piece that kind of like did a lot of work into thinking about like the theoretical kind of like weight that black feminist literature held in terms of changing the way in which we think about like how capitalism and systems of anti-blackness and like racial and sexual violence are able to kind of create a particular like system that thrives off of the ability to like end the survival of like black people and black resistance and blackness as like an excessive force. And a lot of what Alexis Pauline Gumbs writes about is like how does black feminist literature kind of show up in these excesses, and in what way does it kind of like offer new ways of thinking about like communal relationships, forms of mothering, and other types of like survival strategies, and ways to like share those strategies in ways that are particularly important, which I think is like really relevant to a lot of the stuff that's happening on this resolution. Because as you kind of start transitioning throughout her work, she kind of does some other archival works, particularly in the context of M Archive, which is her second book, that is kind of like this experimental piece that is like done through like various types of poetic works, various types of like academic like writings and thoughts that she kind of has about like the way in which the conditions of late capitalism, anti-blackness, and the environmental crises that we kind of like currently sees ourselves in basically extends itself beyond the capacity of like the human to have something to deal with. And so it kind of like thinks and theorizes like what black feminist theory looks like at the end of the world, and theorizes why that apocalypticism kind of changes our relationship to black womanhood, science, art, spirit, and our relationship to the scholarship and politics as a whole, all of which I think are really relevant to the question of what we do on space. Because I feel like a lot of the ethos of like the affirmatism of the resolution itself from this year is like how can we kind of like stop the privatization of space in order to like help the collective human vitality. And I definitely think a lot of those places are ones where I see like this particular type of argument being like useful against, because I think that there are a lot of ways in which this argument is able to set up like really important like ways of kind of like framing the debate in such a way that other teams have a hard time being able to kind of like track you down to one particular kind of like one line usage of like your relationship to science. And it's really just about like why epistemologically we kind of can do so from, we can kind of offer an alternative perspective for how we're able to like not only document black life, but also the way in which we understand like what is kind of foundational to like how blackness like kind of extends itself across theory, and being able to do so in a way that kind of like critiques the way in which science technology is produced in the context of vitality. And so I feel like the kind of like ethos of the of like normative affirmatives and normative like readings of the resolution are about ways in which like that kind of like vitality can be preserved in a way that kind of keeps global peace, in a way that like transition space into something that's used for denomination into something that can be used in order to produce like various types of like equitable redistribution around the public. And I feel like Gumbs' work really offers an interesting way to think about a critique of that, because it's kind of like says that by seeing into that like overinvestment into the redemption of the human and the way in which it kind of moves us towards apocalypse in the way that like Black feminist work has kind of like theorized, like that kind of like looking and seeing from the apocalypse allows us to like understand what kind of like new communal lines need to be drawn and the ways in which we can kind of like understand a different kind of practice for the recovery of like what is kind of lost in these various archival movements. And I think that being able to kind of like talk about these kind of like contexts is like super important for how you're able to like think about like ways that you can kind of like maybe blend some of the ideas that we've talked about in other series from like Afrofuturism and like racial capitalism stuff, and kind of think about a different particular way of like how that kind of combines itself with like the way in which Black feminist theory is considering these terms and the way in which they affect Black women in particular. And I think that kind of like offering it from that vantage point definitely opens up like a really interesting way for you to critique some of the core values of like things like the private and public distinction that are like latent within the resolution, other things like that kind of like overinvest in these very like humanistic divides and distinctions between like how we're able to understand like where Black life shows up. And I also feel like it allows you to get out of like a lot of the offense that people will kind of like have normatively ready for arguments about like futurism and stuff like that, because I feel like their arguments will kind of like mostly be in the lens of like what is practical, how we can engage those things in materiality, etc. And I think that Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work does a really good job of like exploring why the kind of theoretical approaches that are offered by Black feminists like open up various types of like language and distinctions that are necessary for kind of like recuperating and kind of destroying, not recuperating the way in which value is kind of lost in relationship to Black feminist scholarship because of like the conditions that are produced by capitalism and anti-blackness, etc., while also explaining how like the future kind of like holds like endless possibilities, even if those possibilities aren't like positivist relationships to like a utopic explanation of the future, but rather a question of like how that survival is continually produced by the ways in which like Black people and Black feminists show up in these various types of theories. And I think that allows you to pull a lot of net benefits and a lot of like interesting conversations between Gumbs' work and like a lot of other authors that are thinking about what it really means to think about Blackness as this kind of adaptable force that offers like a different lens for how we think about survival in relationship to human vitality as a whole. And so hopefully this kind of like base introduction to what I'm thinking about in terms of Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work in relationship to space and privatization is helpful for kind of like setting the stage for some of the other videos I'll be doing here. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in and watching.